am ready.
Awesome. Take it away.
Yes, Mr. James Ford is with us today from North Carolina. He is a leader. He is an advocate. He is the director of the Center for Racial Equity in Education. He has recently been appointed by our governor to serve as a member of the North Carolina State Board of Education. He's a former educator. He's just doing great work in North Carolina. I'm proud to say that he's repping our state well in his advocacy work. And he has a podcast that he does, for us, and it is phenomenal, Between the Margins. So I want everybody to unmute yourselves and give him your best DSC welcome, clap, whistle, or other encouragement sound.
Yay, James!
Welcome.
Ashe.
Welcome.
Ashe.
You better hit it out of the park now.
Hey, that's some energy right there through the Zoom. Let me tell you something. And appreciate the introduction, Kim. And Mama Deborah, I see you out there.
Hey!
What's going on? Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation, most especially. Honored by the opportunity to even sit here to you for a couple of minutes, without even having to say it. Y'all know that, like, that's what it's about right there. And they keep us honest. And so it's a privilege to have be able to sit before y'all. I want to talk to y'all a little bit about this topic right here, which is the multiple manifestations of violence in schools. And it's going to be informed, kind of by a personal narrative, and then a little bit of context about how things are going in North Carolina. But hopefully what's happening here serves as a microcosm for the whole country, and it presents us some lessons that we can learn from. As Kim mentioned, I'm the director of CREED, the Center for Racial Equity in Education, an organization dedicated to closing racialized opportunity gaps for students of color in North Carolina. We do research, we do engagement, and we do implementation work. But I'm going to be leading kind of with some personal stories a little bit and kind of telling you a little bit about what brings me to this work and why I'm so passionate about it. So, always funky trying to get the controls. All right. So, oops. Forgive me. Y'all seen all my old school pictures and everything. All right. Give me 1 second. Here we go. So I want to kind of begin with my personal story. And since we're on the heels of Father's Day, I figured it's appropriate to kind of talk about my dad. This is him right here. And as y'all could see, like, not only do we resemble, but we got a similar type of energy. You know what I mean? If you look at the picture in the upper left corner, like, that's the type of dude that he is. My father is an older individual. So my dad is 40 years older than I am, and born and raised in upstate New York, and moved to Illinois, which is where I'm originally from before I moved to North Carolina. Born and raised in a city called Rockford, Illinois. Very racially polarizing city, about 90 miles northwest of Chicago, kitty corner between Milwaukee and Chicago. If you know anything about the Midwest, you know that, like, what's happening right now in Minnesota and other localities, like, that's very characteristic of the Midwest. The South gets the rap for being overtly racist, but the sort of subterranean and covert racism that we're seeing exhibited now, that very much characterizes that region. And so my father is a very socially conscious individual, well-read, and he raised us to be, to have knowledge of self and to assert ourselves in situations and circumstances. And so I want to kind of use my dad and the lessons that he taught me as a frame for some of the encounters that I have and set us up for where I feel like that, some of the obstacles that youth are dealing with right now. I want to lead by telling a story about myself. This is me in the 7th grade. I did not write the boy on there. That looks arrogant. Somebody wrote that in my yearbook, but clearly identifiable, had a lot less hair, wore glasses at the time. But I want y'all to look at this kid, because this kid was a very mediocre student. Went to a school that was often characterized as the bad school for obvious reasons, right? It was populated by mostly Black and brown kids on the west side of town, which in my city is the side of town where all the kids of color and families of color come from. But much like, the present circumstance that a lot of students find themselves, you know, a lot of our instructors were white, right? They didn't come from our environment. They didn't come from our backgrounds. And a lot of what they did and the way that they behaved in their discourse and in their pedagogy and approaches was inherently oppressive, right? So you take a kid like myself who never really got in a lot of trouble, certainly wasn't a tough guy, you know, wasn't ultra popular, was always talkative, not gonna lie, and had ADD. You know, I engaged in a lot of off-task behavior, but I wasn't really, you know, a bad kid by any stretch of the imagination. There were two central experiences during this grade that really, I think, speak to the topics I'm going to be talking about today in terms of the manifestations of violence, but also shape my approach to this work. First thing you should know is that, you know, I was in an English class with a particular teacher that I had, a white woman teacher, who I could tell from the outset really didn't have a high opinion of the students in that class. Now, without knowing anything about the composition of that class, you can probably guess what the complexion of the class looked like, majority Black and Latinx students. And, you know, we come with our own cultural assets and features about how we learn and how we engage. And there was a clear mismatch between the way that she wanted to run the classroom and the way that we engaged. And I won't pretend and act like everything was always in order. There was no off-task behavior or none of that. But what I could detect even at that age, but there was a clear adversarial relationship between the person at the head, at the seat of instruction, and us, the students. And she used to engage in, you know, just, you know, microaggressions is how we're terming now, that at the time I didn't really know how to phrase it, but always felt uncomfortable. Well, long story short, there was an incident where one of my classmates, while joking, said, "Ooh, Jimmy," which is what everybody called me back in the day. "Ooh, Jimmy got a gun." Everybody in the class erupted in laughter because, you know, as I mentioned, I was not a tough guy and it was clearly a joke. And she, after the class burst out in laughter, she admonished everybody to calm down. And after, you know, class had ended, the bell rung, I went on to one of my other courses, other classes throughout the day. Unbeknownst to me, a knock came on to my next class's door, and it was two police officers there. Two police officers who were SROs at the school. They asked the teacher where James Ford was, and she pointed in my direction, and they gestured for me to come with them. They took me out to the hallway. I had no idea what I was being requested for, and they told me to go to my locker. There were no administrators around, nobody but me and these officers. They took me to my locker, and they engaged in a search. They emptied my bag, they emptied my locker, looked through everything, and whatever they were looking for, they clearly did not find it. It came to my knowledge later on that that teacher had gone and reported to the administration that I did in fact have a gun, all based on that joke. And what I thought was a particular violation was that not only was there no administrator around to oversee that process, but they had not even contacted my parents until after the fact. And my father, you know, is kind of a reformed hothead. There's only a couple of times I can recall him cursing. And when I called the school and told him what happened, he was enraged. And I remember him vividly saying, "I'm sick of this shit. And I apologize if that's not welcome in this space." But I think it communicates the sort of rage that a lot of Black parents feel on behalf of their students in the relationship that they have those officers. And I always remember the feeling of humiliation, knowing, of course, that this was a joke. It was said in jest, but that teacher thought it worthwhile to go ahead and report me, right? To treat me as a suspect, regardless of that fact. The other thing I recall about that particular class was that I hated it. I hated that class for a number of reasons. It was uninteresting, but most importantly, I didn't see myself in the curriculum. I didn't see myself being portrayed with any sort of dignity. And as I mentioned, I come from a household from a father who at the time, hadn't completed any higher education formally. He has gone on to do that after the fact in his life, but was just a well-read individual, a learned individual, a critical thinker. And he engendered that and imputed that to us. So we grew up reading books about ourselves. We knew and had a very Afrocentric perspective on ourselves. We understood who we were throughout history. We, didn't rely explicitly on education to furnish us with that. The one time I recall in this class ever really learning about myself was reading this book right here, Decay. And I don't know if y'all remember anything about, have ever encountered this book or know anything about the book Decay. But I remember reading this and rolling my eyes at every turn, because the book was essentially about a white boy and a black man, a West Indian man, who had gotten shipwrecked while fleeing the territory of Curacao. And they end up in this cave. Just the two of them are the lone survivors. The white boy is blinded, so he doesn't realize that the man who was shipwrecked with is black. This man does everything he can to help this boy survive, teaches him how to fend for himself. He provides food. He essentially is the caretaker of this boy. When his temporary blindness wears off, and he sees that the individual given taking care of him, he engages in racism. He uses the N-word repeatedly over and over again and exposes his racial prejudice. And the basic end of the story is the man, this black man who is bearing the labor and the burden of taking care of this white boy, dies. And after a year being stranded on the island, the white boy is then saved. And even as a young person, I was like, now this is some crap, right? Now this is some mess. I didn't feel like this story dignified me, and the type of literature that I wanted to read when I was given the opportunity to do a book study on my own in this class were books like this. This is the book that I was reading in 7th grade. Seize the Time by Bobby Seale, learning about the formation of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And so you contrast these things, and to be clear, these texts don't come out except for maybe 2 years apart. One clearly is asset-based and talks about real life, portrayals of folks who really have taken self-determination and their own manhood into their hands. And another one is a racist trope. And I think that both of those stories exhibit different forms of violence in different ways. And I wanted to use those as a frame to draw on my own personal experience as a student to kind of set up what I'm gonna talk to y'all about today. And there's two forms of violence in my mind. There's the physical violence that we've seen pervaded on our social media timelines and on our television screens that comes as the result of abuse of power at the hands of police and of vigilantes. There is that form of violence, a long history of it, a catalog of bloody barbarism that has taken place in the United States of America, targeting Black bodies as well as other non-white bodies and people of color. But there's also curricular violence, which I feel like is equally damaging, and in some cases maybe worse, because of what it does to the minds of individuals who are the recipients of this miseducation. And so I want to talk to you about both of those things. But I want to start with this quote, which is what my father used to tell me, and it's what I've embodied even as an educator. He said, a child solely educated by the education system is an uneducated child. And I think the reason why my father said this is because he understood that if it's a critical lens towards the way that the traditional American education system operates in this country. The sort of narratives that are cast, the people who are centered, right, and the ways that they're portrayed. He knew it was his duty and my mother's duty to make sure that they furnished us with an education that offered counter narratives. And I feel like in this moment, we have to seize the time, to use the pun, to redevelop and rethink the way that the education operates and to transform, not reform, it into something that truly centers the lives and the experiences of students of color. So I want to begin by talking about physical violence. I know that y'all have a couple of campaigns that you're engaged in right now, and one of which is a campaign for, counselors, not cops. And, y'all have been engaging in that work long prior to the sudden wave of districts such as, Minneapolis, Denver, most recently Oakland, that are calling for the ouster of SROs, school resource officers, to leave the schools, right? That schools are no longer a place where those individuals should be. And I want to pause to say that I think that that's ultimately the right approach for a host of different reasons. One is I want to provide these clips of news stories that are pretty recent North Carolina-based stories that exhibit the problem. These are recent. One is from 2017 and one I believe is from 2019 last year. In Roseville, which is outside of Raleigh, which is about two and a half hours from where I'm at in Charlotte. There was a school resource officer who slammed a girl to the ground, violently caught on video, who was trying to break up a fight. And again, these incidences are recurring as a catalog of them all throughout the country, but these are ones that hit close to home that ended up making national headlines. But I think, again, it demonstrates the problem of, the roles that school resource officers often play in schools, when really these are environments that should be places of learning, places of safety. Or more recently, when a Black school resource officer in Warren County, which if y'all are not familiar with North Carolina, that's a Black rural district, right? It's seen slamming a little Black boy, 11-year-old Black boy down. And so again, Henderson County rather. These things are continue to exhibit the problem. And, a lot of the argument for SROs in schools is because for some populations, the presence of police officers represents a degree of safety, particularly since Columbine, right? Folks want to feel safe. But I think it's important to contextualize that, right? Who are the populations that are calling for that, number one? And who has typically felt safe in the presence of police officers? And then as a history teacher by trade, one must take time to interrogate the very foundations of modern American policing. The fact that they evolved from slave patrols, and so literally, foundationally, their objective is to police Black bodies, right? And to govern where they can and should not be. Even now, we know that about close to 60% of schools in the American education system have the presence of a sworn officer. But disproportionately, those schools tend to be those that have high populations of students of color. And so again, there's correlations here. And despite the fact that I can tell you personal stories of excellent SROs who I encountered at schools. Again, I taught at Garinger High School in East Charlotte, majority Black and brown school. And there's a brother who lives in my neighborhood who was an SRO. I've seen this brother come through and de-escalate situations with students who could not be consoled otherwise. I recall a student who was told to leave a bus in the bus lot. I remember I was there, saw it with my own eyes, would not respond to anybody in the administration. When this police officer got on this bus, he talked to this brother in a calm manner, said the student's name, said, "Hey man, it's me. Who was there to get you that gift for your birthday? Come on, listen to me now." And the student said, "You." He said, Who was there to talk to you when you got kicked out the house? Who was that? And the student responded that it was him, right? They had a pre-existing relationship that allowed for him to pull on that capital when necessary to remove that student from that situation and de-escalate it. But I'm not going to paint and make a generalization, say that that's the majority of times of how things goes. I've seen SROs who have said verbally they couldn't wait to tase students and have done so on campus. And so it's not an individual problem as much as it's a problem with structure, with a system of policing and a culture that is ultimately adversarial to Black bodies and Black communities. And so I wanted to draw that distinction that nobody I don't believe is painting all SROs with a broad brush, but it's not really an individualized problem as much as it's an institutional problem. And that's the way we have to look at this. The other thing I want to draw to your attention is that, as I mentioned, some of the work that we do at the state level is we do some research. We did a research document called Erasing Inequities, which looked at the multitude of ways that race shows up in North Carolina public schools. And, we looked at 30 to 40 different education indicators, and we disaggregated and looked at race, and we controlled for a bunch of other factors. And we showed that race is a huge factor. And we know that race shows up in discipline, which we'll get into a little bit, but I also want to pause and say that's not the only place that race shows up and constricts opportunities for students of color. With all due respect to all of the other systems, whenever there are marches and whenever there are calls for justice, we are clear on how housing robs people of opportunity. We are clear on how the criminal justice system robs folks of color of opportunity. I don't think we properly respect the role that the education system plays in perpetuating systemic racism. It boils down to everything from the veteran teachers that are who are being taught by early career teachers versus veteran teachers, the composition of the teaching workforce, who gets access to rigorous courses like AP and IB and honors, who gets identified as having special needs, of course, who is suspended, who gets identified as gifted, the performance on benchmark assessments. There is a catalog and a myriad of ways that racism continues to rob and constrict opportunities. I think the difference is it does it in a way that's slow motion. Whereas we can watch a video of someone being knelt on and having the life literally sucked out of them and pushed out of them. What happens in the education system that people spend up to 12 years in is that it's a slow death and it's delayed, right? So they may not feel the effects of that until maybe 20 or 30 years after they come through our system, but it's a death nonetheless. One of the areas that we looked at in our report was discipline. And so when we talk about SROs, when we talk about, the physical violence, we have to be clear on who is disproportionately bearing the brunt of the disciplinary practices. And in North Carolina, you can see here in this graphic, when you look at the state average for OSS, out of school suspensions, and the state average for ISS, in school suspensions, it doesn't take a genius to see that clearly Black and in some cases multiracial and indigenous folk are clearly getting a raw deal. And so the question we got to ask ourselves is why? And that has to be an answer that's rooted and grounded in the deeply racist history of the United States. So not only are there SROs that are at the schools themselves, because of the experiences of different people groups, oftentimes tend to be places of historical trauma, right? Schools are not always a place of bewilder and wonderment for folks, or where imagination takes flight and people's greatest dreams come true. Some schools feel like colonial outposts. They feel like forts that are set up behind enemy lines, and they're not parts of community. And so when we have a conversation about police and schools, you got to understand the populations that are being served and the various disparate histories that those different groups have with not only the education system, but with the police force writ large, right? So it's our kids, Black and brown kids and indigenous kids, that are being suspended at disproportionate rates. And then when you look at what the offenses they get suspended for, right? So who's going to bear the brunt? Who's going to end up being adversely impacted? Who's going to have disproportionate contact with police or just suspensions in general? There are two general categories of offenses that people get suspended for. You have what are objective offenses, and these are offenses that researchers say are things that don't require a whole lot of decision making because they're objective. Things like assault on staff, damaging or vandalizing property, contraband on campus. There's not a whole lot of wiggle room. You pretty much, either you got the trash can on fire or you didn't, right? Either you bought some dope to school or you didn't. That's not where there's disproportionate minority contact. Where we tend to have disproportionate contact for kids of color, and specifically Black folks, is our subjective offenses. And these are the areas where, it's a judgment call by those who are in authority or those who are in a position to allocate discipline. These are things like aggressive behavior, things like insubordination, things like disrespect. Well, tell me, if I ask everybody in this call, what's disrespect, what's insubordination, I'm gonna get a host of different definitions because it's clearly based upon the cultural lens through which someone is looking, right? There are things that Black folks do that are considered offensive or disrespectful that are really just, everyday occurrences. The way we stand, the way we walk. There's literature that even shows that teachers form impressions on students and their ability and their behavior just by the way that Black kids walk, right? So when you start talking about those being the things that are disproportionately areas where kids get suspended, the whole idea of now, feeding students into the school to prison pipeline through disproportionate contact with the criminal justice system, this is the moment we have to start scrutinizing that and thinking differently. In North Carolina, this information is provided by the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. And you see, students that come in contact with the juvenile justice system, 45% of those cases are school-based offenses. So again, who's at their school? Nearly half of them are school-based. What's happening at the school? And then you see the next graphic in the middle. About 48% of those are Black kids. The problem is in North Carolina, you look at the last one, Black kids only comprise of a quarter of the overall public school enrollment. So again, disproportionately, it's us who are being funneled. Not only are we being cited for infractions and being suspended, but we're also the ones that are being sent often by the police, arrested and sent into the juvenile justice system. And so there's plenty of data that shows this is a problem, and it's violence, and it's something we got to respond to in this modern era. I do got to give a shout out to our Chief Justice, Sherry Beasley, who started an initiative called the School Justice Partnership, which seeks to lower incidences of contact with law enforcement by partnering with school districts and other stakeholders and trying to find alternative ways that avoid exclusionary disciplines such as suspensions and expulsions. This is something that began in Wilmington, and I'm gonna put a pin there because we're gonna return to that. Wilmington, North Carolina, but all of our 100 counties have not even signed on to this yet. So this is something that happens in select districts, but it's not everywhere. And if I'm being honest, it's a nice start, but it's not enough. We have to dream a little bigger at this particular moment. So I said Wilmington. Why? Because for those of y'all who are like me, who are news junkies, you may have heard about this incident last month or the month before, where out in Wilmington, a student who actually went to Michael Jordan's alma mater, Laney High School, was confronted by a white mob. They were looking for a white girl who they thought went missing, and they suspected for whatever reason that this girl was at this boy's house. They showed up armed, and they knocked on his mother's door, attempted to intimidate her. There were sheriff's deputies who were part of this mob, okay? And if you know anything about Wilmington, I'll return to that. There's a history there. But the reason why I want to pause there parenthetically is because we're talking about law enforcement being at schools. Here you are, a young man who was a graduating senior, and law enforcement individuals in this mob, some of whom are law enforcement, feel emboldened enough to show up at his house armed to terrorize his family. This to me illustrates that there's something corrupt at the root that can't necessarily be reformed, and certainly shouldn't be playing a role at the schools, because it helps to create, instead of a trauma-informed environment, and one that is emotionally intelligent and speaks to the social and emotional aspects of children, it's only going to further traumatize folks who already have a history of trauma with police forces. So now we talked about that, let me talk just briefly about curricular violence. I'm gonna use, again, Wilmington as a frame because I feel like it's apropos at this moment. So as I mentioned, there's a reason why Wilmington keeps popping up. Wilmington is the only successful site in the United States history of a successful coup d'etat, a successful government takeover. Wilmington, during Reconstruction, was the site of what was called fusion politics. You had progressive, populist white folks who were running this town with Black Republicans. You had lots of Black wealth here. You had Black folks in prominent leadership positions, municipal positions. And, you know, there were a lot of white folks in the area who couldn't stand it. And it was not a race riot. It was not just a massacre. It was a coup d'etat. It was a political overthrow. There was a transfer of property, and it was a transfer of actual political titles that happened as a result of the government was officially taken over. And this happened in 1898, November 10th of 1898. And this is something I didn't learn about till I got much older. Why? Because when it comes to American education, what we find is that the curriculum is often a tool of propaganda, right? You all have heard the phrase that, you know, the winner writes the history. And I would submit to you that this is curriculum violence as well. That individuals can grow up and go into adulthood having never heard of this story, having never heard. There are individuals in North Carolina who are just learning about the coup of Wilmington in 1898 right now. There are individuals who are just learning about Black Wall Street and the bombing of Black Wall Street, this prosperous Black community, business community, in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. How is that possible? That's facilitated through a deliberate miseducation of the general American population. Often likened as a history teacher, curriculum to a group picture. Whenever I would teach my students in world history, I would promise them that no matter who they were, no matter where they came from, they were going to see themselves in my curriculum, and they were going to learn about the people that they came from. But if you think about a group picture, what if we all assembled in one room, if we were all here, we would all organize ourselves in some sort of way with rows, and somebody would stand off with the camera and they would take a picture. And the two things we would want to know when that picture got developed is, where am I and how do I look? And the way we often approach curriculum in the United States of America education system is we crop certain individuals out of that group picture. And we decide to center that curriculum on a certain group of people, certain background, right? Mostly white dominated middle class populations. And the message that that sends is inherently violent, because it violates us by telling us that our narratives, our stories, our perspectives don't matter, that they're not important, that they don't comport to the image and to the discourses of the dominant American narrative. And that violates us because it also allows us to grow and be quote unquote educated, having not known these stories. And so here we are learning about Black Wall Street from shows on HBO, like The Watchmen, right? This is also violence. Students deserve to learn about themselves and see themselves represented in every aspect of the curriculum. Every subject ought to be presented from perspectives that honor the histories that those groups come from. Their culture has to be honored and affirmed, and not only should the culture be taught to, but it ought to be taught through. When any of these things are driven past and when any of these things are cast aside, we have to begin to start calling those things out as violence in the same way we would call out individuals slamming one of our children on their head on school grounds. This is equally violent because it allows individuals to go through life ignorant and forming these erroneous assumptions about different people groups. But it's the stories like Wilmington and countless others and indigenous groups, right? And Latinx folks that deserve to be pushed from the margins and be put in the center. And so as we begin to call for transformation in this education system, it's my hope that we take on curricular violence with the same vigor and with the same energy as we would our physical violence. I happen to work with all the principals, all 42 principals this year. Creed has a contract with New Hanover Schools. And, you know, so we're frequently out there working with those principals to helping them to adopt culturally responsive practices. And they have changed the site. This used to be a sign that said Wilmington Race Right, and they changed it to reflect the accurate history of what happened. They're now calling it the Wilmington Coup. And they're talking about beginning to unravel the white vigilante violence that took place there. But I think that serves as a microcosm for the ways in which we approach education in the American education system. And it serves as a pivot in this moment to start changing our approaches to ensure that our children are no longer on the receiving end of any forms of violence. As I begin to close, I just wanted to say that, you know, I look at all of this as part of an overall system. You know, it's no small wonder to me that, people are inherently misinformed, that every aspect of the education system that we look at, you continue to see the racial hierarchy, the racial order reinforced. As I mentioned, it's not just one area, and sometimes we tend to relegate our discussion to a particular area, or it's discipline, or it's charter schools or whatever. But the truth of the matter is that every single rung, every single step of the educational experience, our children are being oppressed. And we know that we bring assets, right? We know that our children embody genius, that they come with cultural assets. They come with faculties and facilities that aren't always honored. And so the question we got to ask ourselves is, if the outcome is what the system is achieving, is this a system flaw? Maybe it's just a bug in the system, y'all. Or is it a system feature? That's the way that the system was built to do that. And if the latter is the truth, then how do we coalesce ourselves and organize ourselves and build coalition with other folks to make sure that we destroy that system and we build another one in its place, so that we don't reform it, but that we transform it. We turn it into something altogether different. So that's the question that I hope you'll ponder. And ultimately, I would like to extend Creed as an organization, our willingness to work alongside y'all, even if it's not in North Carolina, because that's what we've dedicated ourselves to doing as an organization. We're dedicated to educational transformation and using the experiences of students of color to help shape the education system as an institution going forward. And so I believe that's my time. I apologize if I went a little bit over, but I did want to leave my contact information here for you. If you so choose to reach out, want to talk, I can be followed on Twitter. But I want to thank you all for the energy, right, for the engagement. But ultimately, this is about liberation, and I want us to lean into this moment. We have an Overton window that's been lifted here, and I feel like we have not just ourselves, but we have scores of ancestors who are helping to guide us through this moment right now to help push us through. And so I want to thank you for what you're doing to make that dream a reality for our students. And thank you again for the invitation to present.
Woo, woo.
Yes.
You go.
You killed it, sir. Killed it. Oh my
Yes.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did.
Thank
goodness.